It's a pleasure to be here today to speak to you about some of the tricks that journalists use when they have to talk about complicated things, complex ideas. And I think, honestly, this is something that I'm quite convinced you can use these tricks to talk about your own research, about the things that you want to convey. So this is us having a peek into some of the things the journalists use in their work and trying to use those instruments for our benefit. The title of our talk today is Meet the Press. And this is obviously a play on the TV show in the US. But we're talking about the ways to present your research to non-scientists, to someone, to the people who don't speak the scientific language, right? This is a problem of interpretation, if you will. Let me go through some of the things that we're going to be covering today. We'll start with the reasons journalists pitch, the things that journalists use, the reasoning behind the idea of pitching itself, and we'll see whether you can use some of these rationales in your own pitching. We'll talk about what a good pitch is and what it is not. We'll use a tool that I call the pitch sieve. It's a tool that helps you turn your pitch into a more precise, more accurate, and more attractive, really, idea. We'll talk about some of the kinds of pitches that I want to offer you. We'll talk about some of the tips and tricks that I have come to know over the years of pitching to editors and other journalists. And then we'll have some practice, obviously, because what's pitching if not a practical discipline? Let's go over to the basic idea why journalists pitch. And let me remind you that you've probably heard the word pitch in a very different context. You might have heard about elevator pitches, which is what startup founders, right, aspiring businessmen give to investors when they end up in an elevator with them, right? And you're supposed to present your idea for a great company in the time it takes for an elevator to go up or down to the floor where the investor will leave, right? So this is a concentrated idea of a pitch. You're supposed to be as precise, as surgical, even in your pitch as possible. For journalists, I guess the stakes are a bit lower. They're not looking for millions of dollars in funding, but they are looking for an opportunity to publish their story. And here are some of the reasons why journalists need to pitch, why they have to do this, why they have to compete for editors' attention and for essentially space in the media outlets. I kind of gave away the first reason when I said that journalists have to compete. The competition is really fierce, especially when it comes to freelancers, such as science journalists. The industry, the way the industry is developing, leads to a lot of journalists ending up as freelancers. So not full-time journalists attached to a publication, but rather people who work for many different outlets. They have to compete against each other because there's only so much money that a media outlet has for freelancers, right, to commission freelance stories. So the competition is really intense. And essentially, you have to your idea rather has to be more attractive than the thousands sometimes of other ideas that an editor might get during this particular month. And I'm not joking about, like, maybe not thousands, but hundreds, certainly, when it comes to journals like Nature or Science, also do science journalism. They might get hundreds of pitches, literally, for a particular issue of the magazine. Another reason for pitching is the way it's so efficient in packaging your ideas for evaluation, right? Sometimes it's not immediately clear whether an idea for its story or a feature story or an interview is good. Putting it into a pitch following a certain formula and some of the formulas we'll look at today. Doing this helps helps the editor evaluate your idea and essentially give it its due. You can be, by using these formulas for pitching, you can be sure that the the process of telling someone about your idea doesn't actually spoil everything for your idea, right? It will be appreciated as it is. Pitching is also important for journalists themselves. Even without the competition and without the need for evaluation, we have to get our ducks in a row, essentially. We have to organize our thoughts. We have to develop this story a little bit further than just, well, this is a nice idea, right? And building a pitch, actually writing out a pitch, helps you do that. It's a very important exercise for creative thinking. Sometimes I don't actually pitch a story to anyone, but I do end up writing a pitch as a document, just to see whether it's whether it's good enough to be developed further, for instance. And then, last but not least, it's important that courtesy is a significant reason. We have to be we have to recognize the fact that editors are under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure to do their job, and putting your idea in a kind of agreed format that everyone recognizes to be optimal is just simply polite, right? It's the polite way to work with an editor. Editors do appreciate this. They realize that if a journalist takes the time to work out a good pitch, a good way to present their story, this journalist will probably be as meticulous and will have as much attention to detail when they're actually working on a story. After we've talked about the reasons journalists need to pitch, we've covered competition, packaging ideas in a agreed format that is easy to evaluate, organizing your thoughts, and then just being polite. I want to ask you to drop some ideas into the chat on whether you think why scientists need to pitch the research to journalists. They need to offer some ideas about what they're studying to journalists, and if they do, why they have to do it, right? Why do they need to do it? To promote the research and be cited, that's actually a great argument in favor of talking to journalists, because there's even research suggesting that if a paper is covered by journalists, which are not, scientists, they're not, journalistic publications are not included in any citation ratings or whatever, right? But still, if a paper is covered by journalists, it gets more citations afterwards, right? So journalists can impact this in a very direct way. You can also increase the researcher's visibility. That's true, and it can be translated into more funding, better PhD applicants, for instance, or postdocs, right? So this visibility also has a direct impact on the journal, on the researcher's work. And it really it's really nice to see some of you mention that science has to serve society. We have to disseminate knowledge. We have to promote the findings to the general public. This is great. It's great that you appreciate this role of scientists as science communicators, essentially the first line of defense against miscommunication, misinformation, disinformation, and so on and so forth. And I would also add that some of the arguments that we've covered for journalists for why they pitch are also true for scientists too. Just as an editor is under a lot of pressure and has a lot of ideas coming at them from different journalists, A journalist is also under a lot of pressure. There's a lot of great research out there, right? It's impossible to write about everything. So if you pitch a journalist, if you actively reach out to someone and talk to them about your paper, your studies, that increases the chances that you will end up being featured in a story, right? So it's a competition of sorts also. The way I break down a good pitch is as follows. It's a strong and complete idea. So I'm often asked whether a pitch should describe the whole idea of the research behind it, right? Or if it should just tease out some of the details but not cover everything. So the answer is a bit tricky because I would have to go to Goldilocks, right? It's not too large, not too small, just right? So the idea has to be complete in a sense that you will get the impression of what the thinking behind the study is, right? There are no questions that arise due to misunderstanding or not understanding your idea, right? It can cause, it should elicit more questions because the idea of a pitch is putting your foot in the door, right? You're giving a journalist just enough information to get interested in what you're about to share with them. So completeness of this idea is a bit tricky. You'll have to figure it out by trying to write out pitches, by building them, and see how much information you can actually share without overburdening your recipient. Another important factor for every pitch, both journalistic pitches and the pitches you can give to a journalist, is time and the right outlet, right? So I'm often asked whether there are evergreen stories, so-called, right? Stories that can be useful and readable at any time. And sure, there are some stories like this, but there are not so many of them. And honestly, even for those stories, there's a better time than just an average day, right? So the pitch, this idea, has to be presented in time, so a bit before the right time, and to the right outlet, the outlet that can have the resources, the capacity to cover this topic, and that has an interest in it. Because if you go to a magazine, like a journal that covers particle physics, and you start talking to them about climate change, they might be confused, right? This is an extreme example, but the takeaway here is that before you actually pitch, you should see whether the outlet that this journalist works for actually covers these topics, right? But a lot of science journalists have beats, they're called. These are essentially specializations. So certain topics that these journalists cover more than other topics, pay attention to those and be focused in your pitch. So approach the right person. And the third part of this, the right time, the right place kind of conundrum, is the format, right? Some outlets don't publish interviews at all, some do. They can have essays, they can have feature stories, all sorts of genres. And if your idea for a story about your research does not fit into this format, it will probably be rejected, not because it's bad or it's not readable, but because it's just not right for this particular outlet. And again, last but not least, the pitch, the idea in the pitch has to be attractively described. Because, and here we can come back to the idea of the elevator pitch. You simply don't have the time for your story idea not to be enticing, not to be fascinating, right? It has to kind of tickle the imagination of the person you're talking to or you're writing to, because it just takes so little time for that person to drop your email, to stop reading, to stop listening. And in that little time, you just have to be as attractive in your description of this idea as possible. So you'll see that some of these components of a pitch actually resonate with your your checklists for group work, and we'll go back to that a little later. So this is what a good pitch is. Now let's talk about what it is not. So, and this comes, believe me, from a great deal of experience in working with younger journalists, especially, and younger science communicators, right? People who present their research to me because they want me to write something about them. This is a typical picture of some of the pitches that I get as a journalist. We have this great speaker for you. She's coming to town. She's coming to our conference. Would you like to interview her? There's this great conference happening next week. Come see what all the research is about. Tomorrow, or in a month, or in next year, we're celebrating a great historic occasion, like a Memorial Day for something, or an anniversary or something. So please write something about that. And sometimes I'm just told that we're all so great here. Please write about us. This is not a good pitch, because this is something that doesn't give me any direction in developing my story. And obviously, there's a slight chance that I might have the time to listen how great the speaker is and appreciate it. But there's a bigger risk of me not knowing how great the speaker is, how great this conference is, and simply not, again, having the time and resources to pay more attention to this. So what do we do with this mess of bad pitches? We use a tool that I call the pitch sieve, right? You put something through a sieve and you separate the stuff you need from the stuff you don't need, right? And here's how this works in general. If you have a great speaker, don't start with the great speaker. Start with the genre of the story that you want to pitch. So for a great speaker, it's probably an interview, right? You want to talk to this person because somehow she is this amazing scientist or this amazing mentor or professor that has something to share with the rest of us, right? So start with an interview, and then immediately when you say it's an interview, you have to think what the interview is going to be about, right? So what is the main idea that the speaker wants to share with the journalist? So now you're much closer to actually figuring out what the pitch is, right? Because you're not just selling this person, you're selling an idea. So the sieve essentially turns events and people into formats, into genres of stories and ideas for these stories. So for a great conference, if it's a conference that is interesting somehow in what's happening there, right? It can be a feature story. If it's a conference that unites a lot of people, a lot of experts in a field, it can be an analysis, right? It can be an analytical story. For an occasion, you can write an explainer, a story that explains why this occasion is important. You can maybe write an essay even, just, share your thoughts on the importance of this great occasion. And I'm not sure what we can do with we're all so great. Maybe you have ideas about this. So can you think of any story ideas, any angles that we can use to say that we're also great? Because this is the question that I've been struggling with. Sometimes what the scientist says is that this is just such a great area of research. It's a lot of stuff is going on. I'm not sure what to focus on, right? So the problem is how you kind of turn this we're all so great into something operational, right? Essentially, something we can work with. Yes, and we'll go back to that in a moment. Let's start with the pitches themselves, because I think it's the meat of the stuff, right? Something we really want to cover today. The first kind of pitch is the simplest one, and it's the most universal one. It's called the Headcell Pitch, And the idea is you there's a Russian expression that says something to the effect of, I'm dressed in my best clothes altogether, right? So this is the pitch where you just present your idea from the most from its most attractive sides, and you use the structure of the pitch to be as precise in this description as possible. It starts with a headline. So here you have to actually think what the headline of a story might be. And there are two approaches to this. There are two ways to write out a headline. It can be an informative headline. That is, you don't joke, you don't use wordplay, you just say something that is informative, right? For instance, climate change will cause more severe weather events is an informative headline, right? There's no wordplay, there's nothing. If you want to be, a bit more risque, I guess, if you want to, if you're absolutely sure that the joke you've thought of is so great that the editor would just buy your story outright, feel free to use the joke in the headline, but I would advise against that in most cases. The next part of this pitch, literally the next line in this pitch, right, is a stand first. So a stand first is a journalistic term for something that is not really a subheading as we are used to thinking about them. The important part about a stand first is that it always has a verb in it, right? So there's always action. It's a subheading with a verb, to put it quite simply, but it explores the idea outlined in the headline a bit further. It adds information that is necessary to appreciate what's in the headline. But the key here is that you have to be specific about an action, right? It can be an action in your story, so what is actually happening in your story, or it can be a description of what your story is going to do to readers. For instance, if you want to write a story about cats, such as the cat that's meowing in the background here, apologies for this, you can the verb can be, we tell readers how to care for cats, right? Or the verb can be, cats meow in the most inappropriate time during your Zoom seminar, right? So the key is the verb here. And then you move on to the actual bullet points on what's in the text. So you cover what's in the story that you're developing. You can see that this is quite straightforward, right? It's a simple outline. It's easy to follow. There's a clear headline that gives an editor an idea of what the headline will look like on the page, right? They can imagine your story being published, and that always helps. You put this idea in the editor's head that this headline sounds nice, right? There are ways to organize bullet points in the main portion of the Headcell pitch, and we'll look into them now. So I will present you with three options here. You can kind of work with them. You can mix and match some of this stuff, but the basic approaches are as follows. You can start with what's called an inverted pyramid. So this is a way of organizing information that goes from most to least important information. So that way you would start with a bullet that describes the most important idea in your story, then the one that's a bit less important, and so on and so forth, right? So because there are just 3 to 5 bullets here, you don't have the time to go into a lot of detail. And that kind of goes back to this idea of being just right in the size of your pitch. You can also use the kebab structure. Much like a kebab, you add different components to it, and you start with an anecdote, a short story, a description of something, a case study perhaps, a little story that is directly related to your pitch, right? The idea. Then you add some basic ideas of your text, exploring this topic that you raise in your pitch, and then you end it with a reference back to the anecdote. So you kind of build the structure that is framed by a little story that is related to your idea. And then the the structure, the scheme that I like most is actually called the Martini glass. You start with an inverted pyramid, so you kind of build it as if you were following this structure. You add a little pause, and then you end with the kicker. What is the kicker? A kicker is the most interesting fact about your story, the most amazing point that you can think of. Let's have a look at an example here. So I have a pitch here, an imaginary pitch for a story on who killed Laura Palmer. The headline is actually going to be, my headline will be who killed Laura Palmer. And you can see that I'm using a question here as a headline, which is possible. There are some limits to where you can do that. But for an imaginary pitch like this, I think it's going to be quite useful to just frame the main question about the story, right? Because ultimately, this is going to be a story about the killer. My stand first is going to use the verb that I really like very much, is relive, right? So here we relive the greatest mystery of our time in witness testimony. This stand first describes the actual structure of the general motive of my story that I'm going to present here, right? Because if you just look at the headline, it could be anything. It could be an essay, it could be an analysis, but this stand first tells us that we're going to look at witness testimony and reconstruct the circumstances of Laura Palmer's killing. And as for the bullet points, this is a bit of a mixed structure here, because we start with a brief scene description. We talk about Laura being dead. Then we add some information on the suspects. And you can see that the last bullet here is obviously the kicker, right? We're hinting at who the killer might be. Right. So this is what it looks like, really. It's just a literal headline, a sentence that explains and elaborates on the headline, and then some bullets. Honestly, I have to say that I don't like the speech structure very much, because I think it's quite simple to serve a lot of purposes, but for some genres of stories that I have to pitch as a journalist, it might be a bit too simple, right? And also, one drawback of this is that you can't really pitch an idea that you haven't thought of yet, right? You haven't elaborated on yet. You have to have a headline, you have to have some bullet points. If you're very early in the story, you might not have that. So what's the way to work here? What's the way to approach this topic here? This is the pitch that I like much better than the Headcell pitch. And I call it the 3-sentence pitch, because it's quite literally just 3 sentences. The first one is, what am I saying? It's an answer to the question, what happened? Why are you writing me this? Why are you writing to me? Why are you reaching out to me? Why are you calling me? So what do you have to say? The second question is, how do I know this? And this question is a bit technical. It is needed to show the editor that you don't just, you haven't just made it up, right? There's some source, there's some citation, there's something that shows that this is not just something you've fantasized about. This is a real story that's going on. And this is why, by the way, this pitch is much more useful when it comes to news, because as a journalist, I have to pitch news stories sometimes. And this is ideal for this, because it's literally in the second sentence that you say, what is the source of this information? Because sometimes this is the most important part. But the key question here is, what does it mean, right? because sometimes it's not immediately clear what you're saying if you're not aware of the context, right? Especially since we're talking to non-scientists, sometimes it's very important to add some context by saying what this actually means. So these are literally 3 sentences. They can be long, but be careful with that. Don't make them too long. And here I have an example for you that's not just a made-up example, like the one with Laura Palmer. It is a real pitch that was successful. I actually sold the story to Nature magazine, and it was published in 2019. It's a pitch about a very obscure document that was published by the Russian government. And let's have a look at this. So there's a brief introduction. I'm just saying that this is a pitch. And then the what am I saying part is here. Russia has just declared its intention to treat genetically edited organisms differently from genetically modified organisms, which are completely banned here, right? Honestly, if you're not following the topic of genetically edited organisms closely, you're probably not aware of what's going on here. And that's fine. My editor also did not know what the difference is. She wasn't, this wasn't her subject. This wasn't her topic. So she had very vague ideas on the difference. But this is my first sentence. This is what I want to say, that Russia wants to treat some genetically edited organisms differently from what's already from GMOs, which are banned here, right? I should have, by the way, used just GMOs. This would have been stronger in the pitch. But anyway, this worked. So the second sentence, the how do I know this sentence? I'm saying that this is in the new strategy for developing genetic technologies that was presented yesterday. And here, the important part is that I don't only say that this is a strategy, a government document. I drop in the reference to timing, right? So this is something that just happened recently. We can still use this as a news story. And then the most important part. I was lucky in a sense that I knew what the most important part was, right? I knew what this meant. And this is, I think, what ended up making this pitch successful, because I was able to argue quite strongly for the need for this story. The third sentence in the 3-sentence pitch here is as follows. The biggest wheat exporter in the world and a generally conservative country when it comes to science sides with the US rather than the European Union in the challenge of regulating genetically edited organisms. So the idea here is that I know that there's a fight between the US and the EU, which have completely different approaches to this. And in this fight, Russia takes the US side suddenly. This is quite unexpected because not only Russia is a generally conservative country, it's also a big player in the wheat market, right? Even though there's no genetically edited wheat so far, but there might be soon. So it's important that a big player in the agricultural market actually joins a more progressive point of view here, right? So this sentence was able to convey this context to my editor, who has no idea perhaps about the technical differences between genetically edited organisms and genetically modified organisms. But she does know what wheat is. She does know that wheat is a huge export good. She knows about the US and the EU, and she knows something about this idea that there's a different approach. There's a difference of approaches here. So this was a successful pitch. This is what it looks like. And as promised, 3 sentences. That's it. If you think you need more than 3 sentences, if you think that your story isn't, fitting into those 3 sentences, you can use what's called a hook, line, and sinker pitch. This is a fishing pitch, I would say. Again, there are 3 components here, but they can be little paragraphs, right? They can be passages, blocks of text, not just sentences. But the components are as follows. You start with a hook, and the hook is something that you actually hook your recipient. your audience, your pitch audience with. And this is the most interesting fact you did not know before, right? So to pick a hook, you have to think back to your story or your research in this case, right? Something that you want to pitch, and find that one interesting fact that you can count on the journalist not knowing, right? So you can be wrong, the journalist might know this, but a reasonable guess is just fine, right? So as long as you find this incredibly interesting fact that you did not know, you can count on the journalist not knowing. You start with this, you describe this fact, and then you use the line. The line here is the story punchline, right? So the main takeaway from the story, the one thing you want your reader, your future reader, to actually learn from this story, right? If they were to learn one thing, what thing would this be? And this is your punchline. And the sinker, the one that seals the deal here, is a line or a paragraph on why you have to be the one to write the story or to talk about it, right? Your personal connection to what's going on in the story. And again, I have a good pitch for you here. It was almost successful because I didn't actually win this competition, but I was, the next in line to do this, to win it. So let's have a look at this. The first, my hook for this story, it's a story about how Mars rovers, right? So these devices that land on Mars and research the red planet, they'll, among other things, they're looking for ice there. And these devices, the actual parts of the rover that are looking for ice, are built in Russia. So my story starts with the hook. And the hook is, our search for water on Mars starts 330 million kilometers away from Mars. It actually starts on another planet. And not just on another planet. It starts in Yakutia. Obviously, my editor, the person I'm addressing the speech to, has no idea what Yakutia is. I could have said Siberia, but I wanted to be more precise. So I actually elaborate on that. I add some information. The Yakutia is a land of diamonds and record low temperatures. This is, by the way, a trick that you can use in your pitches too. Whenever you have a complicated concept, add some information that will make it more accessible, even if it's not, precise, even if it's not accurate scientifically. Try to throw something out there for your recipient to grab onto, right? Here we have diamonds and record low temperatures. So this is my hook. I think this is an interesting fact, that you start looking for water on Mars in Yakutia. The punchline of the story is, as I've kind of already, divulged it when I said that the tools that we use to look for water ice on Mars are designed and built in Russia. And the hunt for water brings together a bunch of people who are not, who don't usually work together: planetary geologists, engineers, and permafrost experts from all over the world. They all go to Yakutia for this particular challenge of building the tools for looking for water ice. And I think so. The punchline here is that the tools are built in Russia. This was going to be the main idea of my story here. And this is the sinker. It's not quite precise here. It's not quite the way I would phrase it if this was the only bit of text that I have. Since this was a grant proposal, there were 2 more pages of me describing the way I would go to Yakutia with the scientists and look at what they're doing. But here I'm just saying that I think this is a compelling story, and I have an opportunity to actually go and have a look at what the scientists are doing, right? So essentially I'm saying, pick me because I can go there. I can be your woman on the ground, right? So just to sum up the 3 pitches that we've covered, the Headcell pitch is a headline, stand first, and some bullet points. The 3-sentence pitch is actually 3 sentences answering the 3 questions that are on this slide. And then the fishing pitch is the most elaborate one, perhaps. We have to use a hook to capture your reader's attention. You have to kind of use a line, a punchline to keep this attention, and sinker to seal the deal. You have to explain why you have to be the one to write it, or in your case, why you have to be the one to tell the story, right? Because obviously you're not the only person in the world who is doing this research in this field. So why are you the one to talk about it? This is important. Just a few pitch tips in general. The first tip is be specific. So give examples whenever possible, and use common descriptors instead of things that might not be understood by your audience. So say Stephen Hawking's disease instead of ALS, right? Avoid terminology. I know this is hard for scientists, but please do avoid them. Avoid the terms you like so much, because if you absolutely have to use them, again, be specific in examples and descriptions. Use that idea. When I was pretty sure that nobody knew what Yakutia is, so I added some information on what that is. And avoid some cliches, just because black gold and red planet are overused in all pitches, so try to stay away from them. Although I didn't, if you remember, I did use this to avoid repetition. So zooming out and zooming in is this idea that you can start with an example of something and then say, this is an example of, and build to a general point. Or you can go vice versa. You can start with a general point and say, for example, and then add some extra information. This zooming in and zooming out helps you kind of move along the story, move along your pitch. Because if you're always focusing on the very kind of broad general perspective, right? This is what those sections in your term papers that describe the relevance of this work, right? They have to start very, very, very general and then zoom quite slowly. Be quick about it. Try to use this as quickly as possible, because sometimes you only have like literally 3 sentences or 3 paragraphs. Whenever possible, again, appeal to cultural baggage, appeal to something that you might reasonably conclude your audience knows, right? For instance, I use Stephen Hawking because you probably know who that is, right? So count on that, and think when you're pitching, think to what the journalists might know, right? Because if it's a younger person, they probably wouldn't understand references to Soviet movies because they might not have seen them. Be at ease, use colorful and provocative wording. And this again goes back to the idea that the pitch has to be attractive. It has to be, it has to capture the attention and hold it for a while. And for this, try to, don't be afraid to be maybe a bit risque, like I said, right? So be a bit provocative with your choice of words. And this probably is counterintuitive because I saved this advice for last, but don't save the best for last. Sometimes people think that they have the time to kind of build up to a revelation about their idea, about their story idea, that has to be so fascinating that the journalists would immediately agree to write about. That will never happen if the journalist stops reading your email before you get to that idea. So don't save the best for last. Open with your best, put your best foot forward, I think the expression is. Some of the questions that an editor might be asking themselves, essentially, right, when they read your pitch. So that would be it from me. Thank you for the time you took to join our seminar today. Thank you for the work you